Have you ever parked somewhere at night and felt like you were being watched? Or woken up to sounds that you couldn't explain? That's exactly what happened to me when I decided to live out of my van and travel across America. What started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare, with strange encounters, unexplainable noises, and places that seemed to defy reality. And the scariest part? It all started with a map that I wish I'd never taken. What would you do if you found yourself lost in a place where nothing made sense, where every shadow felt alive? Before we dive into this true story that changed my life forever, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a creepy experience while camping or traveling? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to read it. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves scary stories, and hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Trust me, this is one journey you'll want to stay tuned for. When I was 26, I thought I had everything figured out. I was tired of the monotony of working a 9-to-5 job, paying rent, and living a life that felt small and confined. I wanted freedom, real freedom. That's when I made the bold decision to move into my 1998 Dodge van, hitting the open road to explore America. The idea of waking up to a new view every morning and living by my own rules felt exhilarating. It wasn't just a lifestyle change. It was a promise to myself to break free from the chains of routine. I started my journey in Idaho, a state I'd always dreamed of visiting for its rugged beauty and untouched wilderness. The first few weeks were everything I'd hoped for. I parked my van by serene rivers, hiked trails that wove through towering pines, and sat by campfires with fellow travelers. Every day felt like a postcard moment. Vast blue skies during the day and star-filled nights. It wasn't just nature that drew me in, it was the simplicity of it all. Life felt stripped down to the essentials. My van, my guitar, and the open road. At first, I was in awe of the silence. There's a kind of peace you only find in the middle of nowhere, where the noise of the city is a distant memory. I loved the stillness of the forests, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the occasional call of a bird. It felt like the kind of freedom I had been craving for years. But as the days turned into weeks, that silence began to shift into something else. Something heavier, more unsettling. At night, alone in my van, I started to notice every creak, every rustle, every sound I couldn't explain. One evening, I found myself in a quiet clearing near the Sawtooth National Forest. It was a spot I had marked from hours of scouring camping forums. The drive there was breathtaking, winding roads flanked by towering pines and distant peaks that seemed to touch the clouds. When I arrived, I couldn't believe how perfect it was. The clearing was large enough to park comfortably, surrounded by thick woods that offered just enough seclusion. It was the kind of place you'd imagine in a nature magazine, untouched and serene. After setting up, I spent the evening outside, strumming my guitar and watching the sun set over the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange before melting into a deep indigo. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, and for a while, I thought I had found my slice of paradise. As the stars came out, I climbed into my van, reclined the seat, and let the cool night air lull me to sleep. I woke suddenly, disoriented. My digital clock read 2:47 a.m. At first, I thought it was the wind shaking the van, but then I heard it, a faint tapping on the roof. It was so light, so deliberate, that I couldn't dismiss it as a falling branch or an animal. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of the sound. The tapping moved, first to the front of the van, then to the back. Whatever it wasn't random. Gripping the tire iron I kept near my bed, I slowly sat up, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The tapping stopped for a moment, and the silence was worse. Then it started again, this time on the side of the van, near the windows. I held my breath, listening intently. There was no whisper of wind, no rustle of leaves, just the rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It felt like whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know they were there. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped, The silence pressed in around me, heavier than before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, clutching the tire iron and staring at the ceiling. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I finally felt brave enough to step outside. The clearing looked just as peaceful as it had the day before, but something felt different. The air seemed colder, the trees less inviting. I walked around the van, scanning for any signs of what might have caused the noise. At first, everything looked normal, but when I reached the back, my stomach dropped. The layer of dust on the rear door had been disturbed, wiped clean in a streak that led directly to the handle. It wasn't the kind of mark a falling branch or an animal could make. Someone or something had been there. As I stood there, staring at the mark, a shiver ran down my spine. I realized how vulnerable I was out here, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and no one to call for help. The isolation that had once felt freeing now felt suffocating. I climbed back into the van, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving the clearing behind without looking back. The drive that morning felt endless. The beauty of the forest seemed to mock me, its towering pines casting long shadows across the road. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something had followed me, lingering just out of sight. By the time I reached the next town, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I pulled into a gas station to fill up and sat in the driver's seat, trying to collect myself. As I looked out at the rows of pumps and the bright morning sun, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The tapping on the roof, the clean streak on the door, those things didn't just happen. That night in the clearing was the first time I felt true fear on the road, and it wouldn't be the last. But as I lay there, gripping the tire iron in my van, I couldn't ignore the tapping that moved from the roof to the back door. Who or what was outside? Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Or was I truly not alone in the wilderness? And why did the van's dust-covered rear door have a perfectly clean streak the next morning? Before we continue, I want to hear from you. What would you do in my situation? Would you stay and investigate, or hit the road without looking back? Let me know in the comments. And if you're as curious as I was about what's coming next, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on. Trust me, this story is only getting started. The evening after my unsettling night at Sawtooth National Forest, I decided to move on. I couldn't shake the eerie tapping or the streak of dust on the van, but I told myself it was all in my head. Living on the road meant encountering the unexpected, I reasoned. Maybe this was just part of the adventure. Still, a gnawing unease had settled in my chest, and I knew I needed to put some distance between me and that clearing. I followed a winding road through Idaho's volcanic landscape, eventually arriving at craters of the Moon National Monument. The place was like stepping onto another planet, endless black lava fields stretching in every direction, jagged rocks glinting in the sun. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but there was something lonely about it, too. The emptiness felt more profound than the forests I'd left behind, and I wasn't sure if that was comforting or unnerving. By the time the sun was setting, I found a small parking area on the edge of the park. It was far enough from the main tourist spots that I had the place to myself. The solitude was what I'd been craving. No voices, no cars, just me and the vast, alien landscape. I parked my van facing the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. As I sat outside, sipping a mug of instant coffee, I let the beauty of the moment calm my frayed nerves. For a while, it worked. The unease from the night before started to fade, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. But peace is fragile. It doesn't take much to shatter it. That night, I climbed into my van, locked the doors, and pulled the curtains shut. I read for a while by the soft glow of my lantern before finally turning it off and settling into bed. The night was silent except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the van's windows. I closed my eyes, letting the stillness lull me into a light sleep. It was sometime after midnight when I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. First, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, irregular, like someone or something was walking slowly around the van. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, listening. I told myself it had to be an animal. Coyote, maybe, or a stray dog. But as the footsteps continued, circling the van, I couldn't ignore the deliberate rhythm. It wasn't random. Whoever or whatever it was, they were pacing. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. The only weapon I had was the tire iron I kept tucked under my bed. I gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat, as the footsteps came closer. Then they stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. And then I heard it, a faint, deliberate tap on the side of the van. My blood ran cold. The tapping moved to the rear doors, light but insistent, like someone testing the metal. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. I stared at the ceiling, clutching the tire iron, as the tapping continued. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? A local checking to see who was parked here? But something about the sound felt off. It was too controlled, too calculated. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the stillness remained. I told myself it was over, whatever it was, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I stayed up until the first light of dawn crept through the edges of the curtains, casting faint shadows across the walls. When I finally stepped outside, the parking lot was empty. The vast expanse of lava fields stretched out before me, untouched and silent. It was almost enough to make me believe I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. I walked around the van, scanning for anything out of place, and that's when I saw it. The dirt and dust that had coated the side of the van were smeared near the back door. It looked like someone or something had dragged their hand across the metal, leaving a faint streak in the grime. My stomach dropped. This wasn't my imagination. Someone had been there. I climbed back into the van, locking the doors behind me, and drove away without looking back. The landscape blurred past as I sped down the highway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone, or something, chasing me. But the road behind me was always empty. Eventually, I reached a small town and pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed to be around people, even if just for a little while. The fluorescent lights and the hum of the freezer aisle were a strange comfort after the isolation of the past few days. I wandered the aisles in a daze, picking up canned goods, bread, and peanut butter without really thinking. As I turned a corner, I noticed a man standing at the end of the aisle. He was tall and thin, with a dirty jacket and a hood pulled low over his face. He wasn't looking at the shelves or holding a basket. He was just standing there, perfectly still. I froze, my heart pounding. Something about him felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned down another aisle, trying to shake the unease. But when I reached the checkout line, he was there again, leaning against the wall near the exit. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his gaze on me. My stomach churned as I paid for my groceries and walked quickly back to my van. I locked the doors the moment I got inside and glanced around the parking lot. The man was gone. That night, I parked at a rest area just off the highway. It was a busy spot with several other vehicles parked nearby, and I figured that would make me feel safer. But as the hours passed and the rest area emptied, I found myself alone again. The silence returned, oppressive and heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. Somewhere in the darkness, I knew something or someone was watching. The bonfire crackled and popped, sending tiny embers spiraling into the crisp Idaho night. I was surrounded by fellow travelers, a mix of van lifers, hikers, and drifters, all with their own stories and destinations. These gatherings were one of the few times I didn't feel so alone on the road. The firelight cast flickering shadows on their faces, and the air buzzed with the kind of camaraderie that only comes from shared solitude. That's where I met Jake. He looked older than the rest of us, maybe late 30s, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed to have seen more than their fair share of the world. He sat across the fire from me, nursing a beer and quietly listening to the conversations around him. He wasn't the loudest or the friendliest, but something about him drew my attention. As the night went on, I found myself sitting next to him, chatting about life on the road. Jake had been living out of his van for years, traveling up and down the West Coast and beyond. He told me about the best free campsites, the tricks to avoiding police hassles, and the places where you could find a hot meal for cheap. "You've been to Craters of the Moon?" he asked, tossing a stick into the fire. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a pang of unease at the memory. "Beautiful place, but weird vibes." Jake nodded knowingly, as if he understood exactly what I meant. "Yeah, that place has its fair share of stories. But then again, most places out here do." He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a folded map. The paper was old, creased from years of use, and smudged with dirt. He handed it to me and I opened it carefully, intrigued. It wasn't like any map I'd seen before. Most of the locations were marked with black dots, but a few were circled in red. "What's this?" I asked, tracing a finger over one of the red circles near Stanley, Idaho. "It's a guide," Jake said. "Safe spots to park for the night. Black dots are the good ones. Quiet, out of the way, no trouble from cops or locals. And the red ones?" Jake hesitated, his gaze flicking to the fire. "Those are different." "Different how?" He sighed, scratching his beard. "Look, I've tried a couple of the red spots. They're fine, I guess, but people say weird stuff happens there. Noises, shadows, stuff that makes your hair stand on end. Some folks swear by them, but others, they don't come back." I laughed nervously, thinking he was trying to scare me. "Come on, Jake. You don't really believe that, do you?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I believe. You'll see for yourself if you decide to try one." I studied the map, my curiosity piqued. The black dots seemed safe enough, but the red ones felt like a challenge, a mystery waiting to be solved. I folded the map and tucked it into my bag, deciding to think about it later. The next morning, I said goodbye to the group and hit the road. The map sat on the passenger seat, taunting me with its cryptic markings. I drove through the scenic backroads of Idaho, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. The farther I drove, the more isolated I felt. Cell service faded, and the occasional farmhouse became a rare sight. By late afternoon, I reached one of the black-marked spots on the map. It was a small pull-off near a river, surrounded by dense trees. The spot was as quiet and secluded as promised, and I decided to stay the night. After setting up camp, I sat by the water, letting the sound of the rushing current ease my nerves. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. That night, I slept soundly. No strange noises, no tapping on the van, just the comforting sound of the river. When I woke the next morning, I felt refreshed and ready to continue my journey. Maybe Jake's map wasn't so bad after all. A few days later, I found myself in Stanley, Idaho, a tiny town nestled in the shadow of the Sawtooth Mountains. The area was breathtaking, with crystal-clear lakes and towering peaks that seemed to touch the sky. I spent the day exploring the trails and snapping photos of the stunning scenery. As the sun began to set, I pulled out the map, scanning for the nearest spot to park. That's when I saw it, a red circle not far from where I was. My fingers lingered over the mark as I debated whether to go. Jake's warning echoed in my mind, but my curiosity got the better of me. How bad could it really be? I told myself it was just another campsite, another dot on the map. I folded the paper and started driving. The road to the red-marked spot was rough and narrow, lined with dense trees that blocked out most of the fading light. My van bumped and rattled over the uneven terrain, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my stomach churning with a mix of excitement and unease. When I finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to make of the place. It was an open clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a single, dilapidated RV parked at the far end. The windows of the RV were broken, and the paint was peeling, but there was no sign of anyone around. The air felt heavy, like the kind of silence that comes before a storm. I parked my van a good distance from the RV, not wanting to get too close to whatever or whoever might be inside. The sun had almost completely set, and the clearing was bathed in an eerie twilight. I climbed into the back of the van, locked the doors, and tried to distract myself by reading. But the unease was hard to ignore. Started around midnight. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps outside. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to the van. I grabbed the tire iron and sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, echoed through the clearing. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It sounded wrong, like something trying to imitate an animal but failing. The van rocked slightly, as if something had brushed against it. My pulse quickened. I peeked through the curtain but saw nothing in the darkness. Then came the tapping, a soft, rhythmic knock on the back door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the tapping growing louder, more insistent. I gripped the tire iron, my hands slick with sweat, and waited. The van shook again, harder this time, and the growl returned, closer now. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the sound stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, too afraid to move. When I finally stepped outside, the clearing was empty. The RV was still there, its broken windows staring blankly at me, but there was no sign of whatever had been outside the van. I walked around the van, my stomach sinking when I saw the scratches on the rear door, long, jagged marks etched into the metal. I didn't stay to investigate. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped away, leaving the red-marked spot far behind. As I drove, I glanced at Jake's map on the passenger seat. The red circles suddenly felt less like curiosities and more like warnings. Warnings I should have heeded. That day, I promised myself I'd stick to the black dots. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd already crossed a line, that something from that red-marked spot had followed me. Leaving the red-marked spot near Stanley, Idaho, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the entire night with me. The scratches on my van, the growls, and the relentless tapping echoed in my mind as I drove further into the mountains. Every turn in the road, every shadow cast by the towering trees seemed menacing. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just some animal, maybe even a prank, but deep down I knew better. Something about that place wasn't natural. The road back to civilization felt endless, but by late afternoon, I reached a small town. I pulled into a gas station with a sense of relief, like I had finally escaped whatever had been out there. The brightly lit pumps and the bustle of locals going about their day were a sharp contrast to the oppressive stillness of the forest. For the first time in hours, I felt safe. After filling up, I parked in the lot to check my van. The scratches on the rear door were worse than I remembered. Long, deep gouges that had stripped the paint clean. Whatever had done this wasn't small or weak. I rubbed my hand over the marks, trying to convince myself it didn't matter anymore. I was far away now, and I wouldn't make the mistake of visiting another red-marked spot. Inside the gas station, I grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, hoping a warm meal might calm my nerves. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile, asked where I was headed. I told her I was just passing through and hoped to find a quiet spot to camp for the night. She mentioned a pull-off near Redfish Lake, a popular but serene location not far from town. "It's beautiful up there," she said, ringing up my items. "You'll sleep like a baby." Her words reassured me. I thanked her and decided that Redfish Lake would be my next stop. A little piece of normalcy was exactly what I needed. The drive to Redfish Lake was stunning, the kind of route that reminded me why I'd chosen this lifestyle in the first place. The road hugged the edge of the forest, with glimpses of the lake sparkling in the distance. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. It was the most peaceful scene I'd seen in days, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this spot would be different. I parked in a secluded area near the lake's edge, far enough from the main road to avoid passing traffic, but close enough to feel connected to the world. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the soft lapping of water against the shore. I set up a small camp chair and watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky transforming into a canvas of pinks and purples. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. As night fell, I climbed into the van, locked the doors, and settled into bed with a book. The soft glow of my lantern illuminated the interior, casting comforting shadows on the walls. The stillness of the lake outside felt peaceful rather than oppressive, and I let myself believe that I might actually sleep soundly for once. But just after midnight, that fragile peace shattered. It started as a faint noise, so soft I thought I was imagining it. A distant rustling, like leaves brushing against each other in the wind. I ignored it at first, convincing myself it was nothing. But the sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. My pulse quickened as I sat up, straining to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the gravel outside the van. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. I reached for the tire iron I kept by my bed, gripping it tightly as I listened. The footsteps circled the van, stopping occasionally before resuming their slow, steady pace. I peeked through a crack in the curtain, but the night was pitch black. The faint glow of the moon barely illuminated the clearing, and I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows. Then came the tapping. It was light at first, a single knock on the side of the van. My breath hitched as I froze, my mind racing. The tapping moved, first to the rear door, then to the passenger side. Each knock was deliberate, methodical, like someone or something was testing the metal. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and heavy. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and unnatural. My chest tightened as the growl grew louder, resonating through the still night air. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. The van rocked slightly, and I clenched the tire iron tighter, my knuckles white. The growling was joined by a soft, scratching sound, like claws dragging across the metal. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to not draw attention to myself. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A faint, flickering shadow passed by the passenger side window, too fast to make out. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the van wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I waited, my body tense, for what felt like hours. Finally, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the curtains, bathing the interior of the van in a soft, golden light. The footsteps, the growling, the tapping, it was all gone. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked as serene as it had the night before. The lake shimmered in the early morning sun, and the birds were singing as if nothing had happened. But when I walked around the van, my stomach dropped. The rear door was covered in scratches, deep gouges that cut through the paint and into the metal. They were fresh, unmistakable. Whatever had been out there had tried to get in. I didn't wait to pack up. I grabbed my belongings, tossed them haphazardly into the van, and sped away from Redfish Lake without looking back. The beauty of the forest blurred past me as I drove, replaced by the gnawing realization that this wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. Something was following me. The map sat on the passenger seat, the red marked spots standing out like warnings. Jake's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, some folks swear by them, but others, they don't come back. Asterisk, I had thought he was exaggerating, that the red spots were just eerie stories meant to scare travelers like me. But now I wasn't so sure. For the first time since I'd started living on the road, I questioned whether this lifestyle was worth it. The freedom, the beauty, the simplicity. It all seemed hollow in the face of what I'd experienced. I promised myself I'd stick to the black dots from now on. No more risks, no more curiosity. But even as I made that promise, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. After the night at Redfish Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The scratches on my van's rear door and the eerie noises had left me rattled. But it wasn't just fear that lingered. It was a sense of being watched, like the unseen eyes of the night were still on me even in broad daylight. As much as I tried to brush it off, the feeling clung to me, growing heavier with each passing mile. I promised myself I'd stick to the black mark spots on Jake's map from now on. Those had proven safe so far, peaceful even. But the more I studied the map, the harder it was to ignore the red excess scattered across it. What made them different? Why had Jake warned me so cryptically about them? The scratches on my van told me to stay far away, but a part of me, the part that craved answers, wanted to know the truth. As I drove deeper into the Idaho backcountry, I realized I was nearing another red-marked spot. It was tucked away in the wilderness outside of Stanley, Idaho. I hadn't planned on going near it, but the closer I got, the harder it became to resist. The rational part of me screamed to turn back, to find a safe pull-off or a quiet campsite marked with a reassuring black dot. But my curiosity whispered louder. What's the worst that could happen? The road to the Red X was rough, barely more than a dirt trail winding through the dense forest. The van jostled over rocks and potholes as trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The location was eerily picturesque. A small cabin stood at the edge of the clearing, its wooden boards weathered and gray. Beside it was a dilapidated RV, its windows broken and its tires deflated. The clearing itself was overgrown with wild grass, and the faint sound of running water hinted at a nearby stream. The place felt frozen in time, abandoned but not forgotten. I parked the van at the far edge of the clearing, as far from the cabin and RV as I could manage. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I climbed out of the van, hesitating as I took in the surroundings. There was no sign of life, no animals, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Ignoring the unease gnawing at my gut, I decided to explore. If I was going to satisfy my curiosity, I figured I might as well take a closer look. The RV was my first stop. Its door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the steps leading up to it were coated in a layer of moss. As I approached, I noticed the faint outline of claw marks etched into the metal near the doorframe, similar to the ones on my van. I peered inside, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The interior was a wreck, upturned furniture, shattered glass, and a strange black substance smeared across the walls. A moldy sleeping bag lay in one corner, surrounded by empty cans and crumpled papers. It looked like someone had lived there, but not for a long time. Something about the scene felt off, like the RV had been abandoned in a hurry. As I backed away, a faint creaking noise echoed from the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding as I scanned the clearing. The cabin's door, which had been slightly ajar, was now open wider. I told myself it was just the wind, even though there hadn't been a single breeze since I'd arrived. By the time night fell, I was back in my van, every door locked and every curtain drawn. The clearing was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, half expecting to see movement outside. It was just after midnight when the first sound came, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the side of the van. My stomach clenched as I gripped the tire iron I kept by my bed. The tapping moved slowly, methodically, from one side of the van to the other. It wasn't the random noise of an animal. It was deliberate, calculated. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, just the steady tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched as I listened, every nerve in my body screaming to run, even though I had nowhere to go. The tapping stopped for a moment, replaced by silence. Then, the van rocked violently, as if something large had slammed into it. I scrambled to the front seat, clutching the tire iron, and peered through the curtains. The clearing was empty, but the cabin door was now wide open. A faint light flickered from within, casting long, distorted shadows onto the grass. Before I could process what I was seeing, the growling began. It was low and guttural, almost animalistic, but with a strange, hollow quality that sent chills racing down my spine. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the van. My chest tightened as I realized whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. The scratching came next. Long, deliberate scrapes against the rear door, followed by more growling. I could hear heavy breathing, slow and ragged, just outside the windows. My hands trembled as I gripped the tire iron tighter, praying the locks would hold. Suddenly, the van rocked again, harder this time, and I screamed. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, as the minutes dragged on. When nothing happened, I dared to peek through the curtains again. The cabin light was gone, and the door had slammed shut. The clearing was still, but the air felt heavier than ever, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the tire iron and staring at the locked doors. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to find deep claw marks etched into the side of the van, worse than the ones before. The grass near the rear door was trampled, and strange, indistinct footprints led back toward the cabin. I didn't stay to investigate. I threw my belongings into the van, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road as fast as it would take me. My heart pounded with every jolt and bump, the fear that something might follow me gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I drove away, I glanced at Jake's map lying on the passenger seat. The red excess now felt like curses, marks of places best left forgotten. I thought of Jake's cryptic warning, the stories he hadn't fully told, and I cursed myself for letting my curiosity lead me there. By the time I reached a paved road, the scratches on my van were the least of my concerns. Something had happened at that red-marked spot, something I couldn't explain. And as much as I wanted to leave it behind, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered in that clearing hadn't just let me go. It was still out there, waiting, watching. I drove without stopping, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The dirt road leading out of the red X spot seemed endless, its ruts and rocks jarring the van with every mile. Every bump made me flinch, as if whatever had been outside my van might still be chasing me. The forest pressed in from both sides, the dense trees casting shadows that seemed alive in the faint glow of my headlights. Finally, I reached pavement. The smooth road beneath my tires should have brought relief, but my nerves were still frayed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurching out of the darkness, but the road behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had scratched my van and rocked it during the night hadn't just let me go. The first sign of civilization came in the form of a gas station. It was a small, run-down place, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the early dawn light. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck parked near the side of the building. I pulled in and parked under one of the dim lights, grateful for the sense of normalcy the station seemed to offer. As I stepped out of the van, the crisp morning air hit me, a stark contrast to the stale, fear-filled air inside. I walked toward the gas station's entrance, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The scratches on the van's rear door glinted under the light, a stark reminder of what had happened. Quickened my pace, eager to be inside. The gas station's interior was eerily quiet. Rows of snacks and drinks lined the aisles, but there was no sign of the attendant. The only sound was the faint hum of a fluorescent light flickering above. I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, trying to focus on something other than the gnawing anxiety in my chest. As I approached the counter, the attendant appeared from the back room. He was a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a weary expression. His name tag read Earl, and he offered me a nod as he stepped behind the register. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Rough night." Earl raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. I handed him a few crumpled bills, and he rang up my items with slow, deliberate movements. As I waited, I noticed something odd. A map pinned to the wall behind the counter. It looked old, the edges frayed, but what caught my attention were the markings on it. Black dots and red excess, just like the map Jake had given me. "Where'd you get that map?" I asked, my voice faltering. Earl glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "Been here as long as I can remember," Why? I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I have one just like it. Someone gave it to me. Earl's expression darkened, and for a moment, he seemed to study me intently. Then he shrugged. Wouldn't trust it if I were you. Those red excess, nothing good ever comes from them. His words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask more, to press him for details, but something about his tone made me stop. I grabbed my items and left quickly, the door's bell jingling faintly behind me. Back in the van, I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the scratched rear door through the side mirror. Earl's warning echoed in my mind, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I needed to get as far away from that red-marked spot as possible. Starting the engine, I pulled out of the gas station and onto the highway. The drive felt endless. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the road, but even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the unease. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. I turned the radio on, hoping the music would distract me, but nothing seemed to help. Hours later, I spotted a small rest area off the highway. It wasn't much, just a few picnic tables and a bathroom, but it was empty, and that was enough for me. I pulled in and parked near the edge of the lot, facing the open road in case I needed to leave quickly. Exhausted, I climbed into the back of the van and collapsed onto my bed, hoping for a few hours of rest. I woke to the sound of tapping. My heart stopped as I lay there, frozen, listening. The tapping was faint but deliberate, coming from the side of the van. Slowly, I reached for the tire iron I kept nearby, gripping it tightly as I sat up. The tapping continued, moving from one side of the van to the other, just like it had at the red-marked spot. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and oppressive. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and unmistakably close. My chest tightened as the growl grew louder, filling the van with its unnatural resonance. I scrambled to the front seat, locking the doors behind me, and started the engine. The van roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the rest area. The growling faded as I sped down the highway, but the fear lingered, an unshakable weight pressing on my chest. By the time I reached the next town, I was running on fumes, both the van and myself. I pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot, choosing a spot near the entrance where I'd be surrounded by people. The scratches on the van's door were deeper now, the metal warped and twisted. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was after me. Inside the store, the bright lights and bustling shoppers felt surreal, like I had stepped into another world. I grabbed a coffee from the deli and sat at a small table near the window, watching the parking lot. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of safety. But that safety was fragile, and I knew it. I took out Jake's map, studying the black dots and red excess with new eyes. Earl's warning rang in my head. Asterisk, nothing good ever comes from them. Asterisk, I realized now that Jake hadn't been exaggerating. The red excess weren't just places, they were something darker, something I couldn't understand. My eyes lingered on the red-marked spot near Stanley, the one I had foolishly visited. The scratches on my van were proof that I had made a mistake. But what haunted me more was the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever had followed me from that spot wasn't finished yet. That night, I parked in a well-lit lot outside a 24-hour diner, determined to stay awake and keep watch. I sipped coffee and kept my eyes on the surrounding area, scanning for anything unusual. But as the hours dragged on, exhaustion took hold. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my best efforts, I drifted off. When I woke, the van was surrounded by scratches. More than before, deeper, angrier. Something had been here, and it had left its mark. I knew then that this wasn't something I could outrun. It would follow me no matter where I went. By the time I left the diner parking lot the next morning, the scratches on my van had become more than just damage. They were a warning. Each gouge in the metal seemed to mock me, a reminder that whatever had found me wasn't going to stop. No matter how far I drove or how many precautions I took, the sense of being followed stayed with me, growing stronger with every mile. I kept driving west, skirting small Idaho towns and sticking to back roads where the traffic was sparse. The map Jake had given me sat folded on the passenger seat, taunting me. I had already promised myself I wouldn't visit any more red excess, but the black dots, the supposed safe spots, felt like little more than false promises now. None of the places I'd parked had been truly safe, and the scratches on my van were proof of that. The weight of the past few days sat heavy on my chest as I reached the edge of a forested area near Redfish Lake. This wasn't a marked spot on the map, but I couldn't keep driving. My body screamed for rest, and the towering trees offered a semblance of cover that made me feel slightly less exposed. I pulled off the road and into a narrow clearing, parking the van beneath a canopy of pines. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the forest floor. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of the van, stretching my legs and breathing in the cool, pine-scented air. For a moment, I let myself believe I might actually have a peaceful night. I decided to explore the area a bit before dark. The forest felt ancient, its towering trees and moss-covered rocks creating a cathedral of green and brown. As I walked, I found a small creek trickling through the underbrush, its clear water reflecting the fading light. I knelt down, cupping my hands to drink, and for the first time in days, I felt grounded. But the feeling didn't last. As I stood, I noticed something etched into the bark of a nearby tree. It was faint but deliberate, a series of claw marks, deep and jagged. My stomach churned as I traced the marks with my fingers, the grooves cold and unnatural to the touch. It could have been a bear or some other animal, but the pattern was too precise, too deliberate. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, and I hurried back to the van. Night fell quickly, the forest swallowing the last light of day. I locked the van's doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to create a barrier between myself and whatever might be out there. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the van settling on its axles. I lay on my makeshift bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching the tire iron I now kept close at all times. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that sent a jolt of fear through my body. Footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But as I strained to listen, they grew louder, more deliberate, circling the van with a slow, calculated rhythm. My grip on the tire iron tightened as the steps stopped near the back door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the darkness. There was no response, just a heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Then, a faint scratching sound began, the kind that sets your teeth on edge. It moved along the side of the van, dragging slowly, deliberately, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know they were there. My chest tightened as the scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the growl. Low, guttural, and impossibly close, it reverberated through the van like a vibration you feel in your bones. I clenched my jaw, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. Running wasn't an option. Not in the middle of nowhere, not with whatever was outside. The growling grew louder, accompanied by heavy breathing. It circled the van, the sound echoing in the still night air. My body was frozen, every muscle tense as I waited for the next move. Suddenly, the van rocked violently, as if something had thrown its full weight against it. I screamed, clutching the tire iron like a lifeline. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The rocking stopped, but the growling didn't. It stayed low and menacing until I thought I might lose my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of sound more terrifying than the noise itself. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. The first rays of dawn filtered through the edges of the curtains, and I finally worked up the courage to step outside. The forest was eerily calm, as if the events of the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But when I walked around the van, the evidence was clear. The sides of the van were covered in fresh scratches, deeper and more erratic than the ones before. They crisscrossed the metal like an angry scrawl, as if whatever had been there was growing more desperate. The ground around the van was disturbed, the grass trampled and dirt churned up, but what caught my attention were the footprints. They were large and oddly shaped, not quite human but not animal either. The prints were uneven, almost distorted, like whoever or whatever had left them wasn't walking naturally. My stomach churned as I stared at the tracks, my mind racing to make sense of them. I didn't stay to figure it out. I threw my things into the van, started the engine, and sped away from the clearing without looking back. The trees blurred past as I drove, the road twisting and turning as if it were trying to keep me trapped. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a small town in the distance, their glow like a beacon in the darkness. I pulled into the lot of a 24-hour gas station, parking under the brightest light I could find. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of the van, the scratches on its sides glinting under the harsh fluorescent glow. I stepped inside, desperate for the comfort of people and noise. The station was nearly empty, save for a bored-looking attendant behind the counter. I grabbed a coffee and a pack of crackers, hoping the simple act of eating would ground me. As I paid, the attendant eyed me curiously. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to speak. He handed me my change, and I hurried back to the van, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for hours, sipping the coffee and staring out at the quiet lot, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the night remained still, the only sound the faint hum of the gas station's lights. As the sun rose, I unfolded Jake's map and stared at the red excess. The events of the night had solidified what I already knew. These weren't just places. They were something darker, something that didn't want to be disturbed. And I had disturbed it. I made a vow to myself then and there. No more red excess, no more risking my safety for curiosity. But even as I made that promise, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The scratches, the growls, the distorted footprints. They were a message, one I didn't fully understand. And whatever was sending it wasn't done with me yet. By the time I reached the next town, exhaustion had seeped into every part of me. My van, covered in scratches, sat like a wounded animal in the parking lot of a small library. I needed answers about the map, about the red excess, about everything that had been following me. My curiosity had led me into danger before, but now it felt like my only way out. If I could understand what was happening, maybe I could figure out how to stop it. The library was quiet, the kind of place where whispers echoed and the air smelled of old books. A gray-haired librarian greeted me with a polite smile as I walked in. I nodded, pretending I wasn't teetering on the edge of panic. My heart pounded as I headed to a row of public computers in the corner, grateful for the semblance of anonymity the library provided. I unfolded Jake's map on the desk, smoothing out its creases, and studied it closely. The red excess seemed random, scattered across the state like drops of blood on a blank canvas. But they couldn't be random, not after everything I'd experienced. There had to be a pattern, a reason these spots existed. I typed the first location into a search engine, the red-marked spot near Stanley, Idaho, where my nightmare had truly begun. What I found sent a shiver down my spine. It was an abandoned campground, once popular among hikers and families. But about 15 years ago, a series of mysterious disappearances had plagued the area. Campers reported strange noises at night, growls, tapping on their tents, and the feeling of being watched. Several people vanished without a trace, and after the final disappearance, a local ranger, the campground was shut down. Authorities cited natural dangers as the reason, but locals whispered about something else, something they wouldn't talk about openly. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. The growling, the tapping, the scratches, it all lined up. My stomach churned as I typed in the next Red X location, this one near Redfish Lake. The stories were eerily similar. Another string of disappearances, this time centered around a secluded hiking trail. Witnesses described hearing footsteps and guttural growls in the woods, often accompanied by strange claw marks on trees. Like the campground near Stanley, the area had been quietly abandoned, left to nature. I kept digging, each red X leading to a darker tale. A fishing dock where anglers reported seeing shadowy figures in the water before vanishing themselves. A remote parking lot where multiple vehicles were found abandoned, their windows smashed and doors scratched, but no sign of the drivers. The more I read, the clearer it became. These red XS weren't just random spots on the map. They were places where people disappeared, where the rules of the natural world seemed to break. The librarian's footsteps startled me, and I quickly minimized the screen. She passed by without a glance, and I exhaled a shaky breath, my hands trembling. I looked back at Jake's map, the black dots now feeling like fragile lifelines in a sea of danger. My mind raced with questions. Why would Jake give me this map? Had he known what the red XS meant? Or had he hoped I'd figure it out too late? I searched for Jake next, hoping to find something that would explain why he'd handed me this cryptic guide. My search led me to a handful of social media accounts and a few forum posts about van life. Most were years old, but one stood out, a post from 3 years ago on a now-defunct forum. The thread was titled, "Maps to Nowhere," and was authored by someone named Jake M. In the post, Jake warned fellow van lifers about a map he'd been given years ago. He described it as old and weathered, marked with black dots and red XS. He claimed the black dots were safe camping spots, but the red XS were something else entirely. He didn't go into detail, only saying that he'd visited one and barely made it out. The final lines of his post sent chills racing down my spine. Asterisk, if you find this map, do yourself a favor. Burn it. Don't visit the red XS. Don't even think about it. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Asterisk. The librarian was beginning to glance in my direction more frequently, and I realized I'd been at the computer for hours. I folded Jake's map and tucked it into my bag, then made my way to the checkout desk. As I walked past, the librarian gave me a curious look. "Doing some local history research?" she asked, her voice polite but probing. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Something like that." She nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on me for a moment before she turned back to her work. I hurried out of the library and climbed into the van, locking the doors behind me. The parking lot was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound too deliberate. My hands shook as I started the engine and pulled onto the road. That night, I parked in a crowded lot outside a grocery store, hoping the presence of other vehicles would keep me safe. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, though. The map sat on the passenger seat, its creases illuminated by the dim glow of the overhead light. Jake's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, burn it. Asterisk. I pulled the map closer, staring at the black dots and red XS, as if they might reveal some hidden truth. The black dots had seemed like sanctuaries at first, but now I wasn't sure if they were truly safe or just decoys, lulling travelers into a false sense of security. The red XS, however, were undeniable. They were traps, lures for the curious and the unwary. But there was something else I hadn't noticed before. At the center of the map, where the black dots and red XS seemed to radiate outward like a web, was an unmarked area. No dots, no XS, no roads or landmarks. Just a blank space. I traced my finger over it, my pulse quickening. What was this place? Why was it unmarked? Was it the source of everything, the growls, the scratches, the disappearances? Or was it something even worse? I folded the map and shoved it into the glove compartment, my heart racing. Jake had told me to stay away from the red XS, but he hadn't said anything about the blank space. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd already had enough of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. The map wasn't finished with me yet, and neither was whatever had been following me. After leaving the library, the map stayed locked away in my glove compartment. I wanted to forget about it, to put everything behind me and go back to the freedom I'd once loved about van life. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling that I was being watched never left. It clung to me, a constant, suffocating presence. Every time I passed a shadowy stretch of road or parked for the night, I couldn't shake the fear that I wasn't alone. I stopped at a small diner off the highway, hoping a warm meal might ground me. The place was empty except for the waitress and an older couple seated in a corner booth. I chose a seat near the window, where I could see my van parked outside under the fluorescent lights. The scratches on its sides seemed to glow under the harsh light, mocking me. The waitress approached with a tired smile. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," I said, my voice barely audible. She nodded, scribbling on her pad. "You look like you've been through the ringer." I forced a laugh, trying to act normal, but my hands shook as I held the menu. When she left, I stared out the window, watching for any movement around my van. The parking lot was still, but that didn't ease my nerves. I kept seeing flashes of the map in my mind. Its red XS and blank spaces burned into my memory. The coffee arrived, and I sipped it mechanically, my mind racing. Jake's words haunted me. Asterisk, some doors shouldn't be opened. Asterisk, he'd warned me to burn the map, but I hadn't listened. Now, it felt like whatever was tied to those red XS was closing in on me. And worse, I'd started to wonder if the map was the only thing keeping me connected to this world. Without it, would I be lost forever? That night, I decided to park at a 24-hour supermarket. It was well lit, with plenty of cars coming and going, and I thought the bustle might keep the fear at bay. I parked near the entrance, where the glow of the store's neon sign bathed the lot in a comforting light. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of safety. I locked the van and settled into bed, keeping the tire iron close by. The hum of activity outside was like a lullaby, and for a moment, I almost believed I could sleep. But that fragile peace shattered around midnight. Started with a sound I'd come to dread. Tapping. Light, deliberate, and rhythmic. It echoed from the passenger side window. My heart stopped as I sat up, clutching the tire iron. The tapping moved, circling the van, each knock precise and intentional. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer, just the tapping, growing louder as it moved to the back of the van. Then, a shadow passed across the curtains, its shape distorted and unnatural. My breath hitched as the van rocked slightly, like something heavy was leaning against it. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then came the growl, low, guttural, and impossibly close. It reverberated through the van, making the metal walls tremble. My chest tightened as I gripped the tire iron tighter, my mind racing with panic. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, as if whatever was outside knew I was trying to escape. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Without waiting, I slammed on the gas, peeling out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something. An impossibly tall figure, its shadow stretching across the pavement. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpoints of light in the darkness. I forced myself to look away, my heart hammering in my chest as I sped down the highway. I drove for hours, the glow of the supermarket fading into the distance. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from my headlights and the faint glow of the moon. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to keep moving. Eventually, I pulled onto a narrow dirt road, too tired to drive any farther. The road ended at a clearing surrounded by trees, and I parked the van in the center, far from the shadows of the forest. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of the van as it settled on its axles. I climbed into the back, locking the doors and pulling the curtains tight. The map was still in the glove compartment, but its presence felt heavy, like it was calling to me. I couldn't bring myself to take it out, but I couldn't ignore it either. The blank space in the center of the map haunted me, its emptiness feeling more ominous than any red X. I sat in the van, gripping the tire iron, waiting for the inevitable. Hours passed, and the night stretched on, the darkness outside feeling alive. Then, just as I began to think I might be safe, the tapping started again. This time it was different. It wasn't just a knock. It was a pattern, a deliberate rhythm that sent chills racing down my spine. Tap, 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 tap. It moved around the van, each sequence growing louder, more insistent. My chest tightened as the growling returned, low and guttural, like something was breathing against the van. The metal creaked as the van rocked, harder than before. I screamed, clutching the tire iron, and shouted, "Leave me alone!" The growling stopped. The tapping ceased. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, a deep, distorted whisper, came from just outside the window. "You shouldn't have come." My heart stopped as I stared at the window, the faint outline of a face pressing against the glass. Its eyes glowed faintly, unblinking, as it stared at me. I screamed, throwing myself into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The van lurched forward, tires spinning on the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood motionless, its glowing eyes following me as I sped away. The trees blurred past, their shadows reaching out like claws, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. When I finally reached the highway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. The road was empty, stretching endlessly into the light. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. My chest heaved as I stared at the scratches on the dashboard, my mind racing. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out the map. The red XS and the blank space stared back at me, taunting me with their secrets. Jake had been right. Some doors shouldn't be opened. But now that they had been, I didn't know if I'd ever be able to close them. And as the light of day spread across the land, I realized one thing with chilling clarity. Whatever had followed me wasn't done yet. It never would be. When I started living in my van, I thought I'd found freedom. A life untethered, full of adventure and possibilities. The open road was supposed to be my escape, a way to break free from the monotony of a conventional life. But the journey I embarked on turned into something far darker than I ever imagined. The map was the turning point. At first, it seemed like a gift, a guide to the best spots to park and sleep. But it wasn't just a map. It was a trap. The black dots, the red XS, and the blank space in the middle, they weren't random markings. They were invitations to places that existed outside of normal rules. Places that weren't meant to be found. I didn't understand the danger when Jake handed me the map. But I do now. I've come to believe that these places marked with red XS aren't just haunted. They're something worse. They're like cracks in reality. Places where something ancient and predatory waits for the curious and the desperate. I don't know if the map created the danger or if it simply revealed it, but one thing is clear. Those who venture into the red XS don't come back the same, if they come back at all. For weeks, I was haunted by the growls, the scratches, the shadowy figure that followed me. Even now, in the safety of my small apartment, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear tapping at the window. The feeling of being watched hasn't left me, and I wonder if it ever will. Whatever I encountered on the road, it's still with me, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to remind me that it's not gone. If you're thinking about living on the road, I'm not here to scare you away from it. Van life can be beautiful, filled with breathtaking landscapes and moments of pure peace. But it can also be isolating, and that isolation comes with its own risks. When you're out there, miles from anyone, you're vulnerable in ways you might not fully understand. It's not just the wild animals or the strangers you have to worry about. Sometimes it's the places themselves. So here's my advice. Trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, leave. Don't let curiosity lead you somewhere you can't return from. And if someone ever hands you an old map marked with strange symbols, burn it. Don't try to understand it. Don't follow it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. I thought I was chasing freedom, but I ended up running from something I still can't explain. And if you're out there, living the dream I thought I wanted, I hope you're smarter than I was. Because out on the open road, you never really know what's waiting for you in the dark. Even now, I can't explain what I encountered on those roads or why it seemed to follow me. But one thing's for sure, I'll never look at an empty parking lot or an old map the same way again. What do you think was out there? Was it supernatural? Something human? Or maybe something in between? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. If the story gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with a friend who loves creepy stories, and make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell turned on so you don't miss the next tale from the road. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay safe out there, and watch where you park.